The oxygen masks dropped. The plane tilted sharply. Commander Jasmine Washington jolted awake as screams filled the cabin. Through the intercom came the captain's panicked voice, "Any fighter pilot on board? The co-pilot's unconscious and I'm losing control." Nobody moved. All eyes turned to Jasmine. "Before we dive into this incredible story of courage in the face of discrimination, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to hear more amazing true stories about people who defied expectations and saved lives when it mattered most." Major Jasmine Washington stared out the small oval window of Flight 2187 bound for San Diego, watching Atlanta grow smaller beneath her. At 38, she had spent nearly half her life in the Air Force, climbing ranks and earning decorations that now felt heavier than the medals themselves. But today, the weight she carried wasn't from her uniform. She had just buried her father, William Washington, the man who had first pointed to the sky when she was 6 years old and told her she could fly anything with wings if she set her mind to it. "Miss, would you like something to drink?" The flight attendant's voice pulled Jasmine from her thoughts. "Water, please," Jasmine replied, turning toward the aisle. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Brenda, barely made eye contact as she handed over the plastic cup. Jasmine was used to this, the subtle dismissals, the way people's eyes sometimes slid past her as if she were invisible. Just getting to her seat had been an exercise in patience. The TSA agent had scrutinized her military ID longer than necessary, asking redundant questions. Then at the gate, the attendant had assumed she was in economy despite her first-class boarding pass. "First time flying first class?" the gate agent had asked with a patronizing smile. "No," Jasmine had answered simply, too tired to explain that she'd flown machines worth millions of dollars in combat zones where mistakes meant death. Now settled in seat 3A, Jasmine observed her seatmate, a white businessman in his mid-40s who had barely acknowledged her when she sat down. His laptop displayed spreadsheets, and he typed furiously, occasionally sighing loudly as if to broadcast his importance. His name badge, slightly visible under his jacket, read, "Bradley Thompson, Regional Director." "Heading home or heading out?" he suddenly asked, closing his laptop. "Home," Jasmine responded, hoping her brevity would discourage conversation. "Business trip?" Bradley persisted, his eyes quickly scanning her casual clothes and settling briefly on her tightly coiled hair. "Funeral," she replied. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, not sounding particularly sorry. "What do you do in San Diego?" The question that always came with assumptions. Jasmine had played this game before. "I'm stationed there," she answered. "Military?" Bradley raised his eyebrows. "Administrative staff." Jasmine sighed internally. "Fighter pilot. F-35s." Bradley's surprise was so transparent it would have been comical if it weren't so predictable. "Really? I didn't know they let, that's impressive. Must be tough being a woman in that position." "It's tougher being good at it while people are waiting for you to fail," she replied, pulling out a small pill bottle from her bag. The conversation mercifully paused as more passengers boarded. A distinguished older white man in an expensive suit took his seat across the aisle, immediately informing everyone within earshot that he was Henry Wilson, retired executive from American Airlines. A few rows ahead, a young Asian woman settled in, her posture and calm efficiency suggesting a professional demeanor. Jasmine would later learn she was Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma surgeon returning from a medical conference. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richard Miller," came a confident voice over the intercom. "We're expecting some weather on our route today, but we'll do our best to keep it smooth. Flight time to San Diego will be 4 hours and 37 minutes. Jasmine swallowed her sleeping pill with the last of her water. Her father's funeral had been draining, not just the ceremony, but the family tensions that surfaced. Her decision to join the Air Force instead of taking over the family hardware store had created a rift with her brother that even their father's death hadn't fully healed. After 5 days of emotional conversations and sorting through her father's belongings, all she wanted was unconsciousness until landing. They say these storms might get worse, Bradley commented, pulling up a weather map on his phone. Doesn't that worry you? Even as a pilot? The pilots know what they're doing, Jasmine said, feeling the medication already taking effect. And turbulence is just bumpy air. Like driving on a dirt road. As the plane taxied and eventually took off, Jasmine felt the gentle pull of sleep. Her last conscious thought was of her father's workshop, the smell of sawdust, and his hands guiding hers on a model airplane they had built together when she was 10. The sky doesn't care what you look like, Jazzy, he'd told her. It only cares if you respect it. 2 hours into the flight, Jasmine drifted in and out of consciousness. In her dreams, she was back in her F-35, performing evasive maneuvers over a hostile territory. The radio crackled with urgent commands as she banked hard to avoid enemy fire. The jet shuddered, but the sensation felt too real. Her eyes snapped open as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. The seatbelt sign had been on for the past hour, and the flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, though their tight smiles betrayed concern. It's just air pockets, completely normal, Brenda reassured an elderly passenger, though her knuckles were white as she gripped the back of a seat during a particularly strong jolt. Bradley Thompson clutched his armrests, his earlier bravado evaporating with each bump and drop. I hate flying, he admitted, his voice strained. Corporate makes me do it twice a month, but I've never gotten used to it. His face had taken on a greenish tinge. Try focusing on something stable, Jasmine suggested, her military training kicking in despite her grogginess. The horizon line outside the window can help. He gave her a grateful glance, then froze as the plane dipped suddenly. Jasmine's pilot instincts had fully awakened now. The turbulence didn't feel right, it wasn't the rhythmic bumping of weather systems but something more erratic. She noticed the flight path on the screen had changed, they were diverting south of their original route. 2 rows ahead, flight attendants huddled in whispered conversation. Said something about the stabilizer, one murmured. Captain didn't want to alarm passengers, another responded, casting a nervous glance toward the cockpit. Henry Wilson unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, ignoring the illuminated sign. Excuse me, he called to Brenda. As a former airline executive, I believe I'm entitled to know what's happening with our flight path. We've clearly diverted. Brenda hurried over. Sir, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. Don't patronize me, Henry huffed. I've been in this industry for 30 years. Is there a mechanical issue? Passengers nearby perked up at his words, anxiety spreading across faces. Sir, Captain Miller has adjusted our route to avoid the worst of the storm system, Brenda explained, her voice lowered. Everything is under control. That's not what your conversation suggested, Henry pressed. I know how flight crews operate, if there's a problem with the stabilizer. Mr. Wilson, I assure you. I want to speak with the captain. Jasmine watched the exchange with growing unease. The man was causing unnecessary panic, but she also suspected he might be right about a mechanical issue. The plane's movements didn't match simple turbulence patterns. Bradley leaned closer to Jasmine. Is something wrong with the plane? You'd know, right? I fly fighter jets, not commercial airliners, she reminded him. But any pilot would divert around bad weather. It's standard procedure. Her practiced calm seemed to reassure him, but Jasmine couldn't shake her own concern. Through the window, she noticed the wing flaps adjusting more frequently than normal, suggesting the pilots were making constant corrections. Wilson had finally returned to his seat, looking smug as he informed nearby passengers, they're having control issues but don't want to cause a panic. I've seen this before. Brenda hurried past, clearly headed for the cockpit. When she returned, her composure had slipped slightly. She whispered something to the other flight attendants, who immediately began checking that all loose items were secured. Jasmine caught fragments, hydraulic pressure fluctuating. Captain says, routine but. The plane banked again, more steeply this time. A laptop slid off a tray table several rows back. A baby began to cry. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been quietly reading medical journals, looked up and caught Jasmine's eye. Something passed between them, a recognition of the growing tension, an acknowledgement that they were both assessing the situation beyond what was being communicated officially. Jasmine's mind ran through emergency scenarios, her training never fully switched off, even when she wasn't in uniform. Part of her wanted to offer assistance, to ask questions that might clarify what was happening, but years of being dismissed or overlooked had taught her caution. In crisis situations, being a black woman often meant having your expertise questioned, your authority undermined. So instead, she remained alert, watching the flight crew's body language, listening for changes in the engine pitch, feeling the subtle shifts in the aircraft's movement that told a story different from the reassurances being offered. The intercom crackled. Captain Miller's voice came through, steady but tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to experience some turbulence. Please ensure your seatbelts remain fastened and all items are secured. Our flight path has been adjusted to seek smoother air, and we appreciate your patience." What he didn't say spoke volumes to Jasmine. There was no estimated time when the turbulence would end, no reassurance about arriving on schedule. The pitch of the engines changed slightly, suggesting they'd reduced airspeed, another indication that this was more than routine weather avoidance. As the plane continued its uneven journey westward, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. Bradley had stopped trying to work, instead clutching a small silver medallion that Jasmine recognized as Street Christopher, patron saint of travelers. Henry Wilson continued to offer loud, expert commentary to anyone who would listen. Dr. Chen had put away her reading and sat with perfect posture, eyes alert, clearly preparing for whatever might come next. In the cockpit, though none of the passengers could see it, Captain Richard Miller and First Officer James Taylor were indeed managing a cascade of warning lights and increasingly uncooperative control systems. What had begun as a weather diversion had evolved into something far more concerning. The violent jolt came without warning. The plane dropped altitude rapidly, then stabilized, only to be rocked by another sharp movement that sent unsecured items flying through the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments, dangling like bizarre fruit above terrified passengers. Jasmine's military training kicked in immediately, muscle memory overriding the last vestiges of her sleeping medication. She secured her own mask first, then helped Bradley, whose trembling hand struggled with the elastic band. "Engine, power loss," he gasped through his mask, eyes wide with terror. Jasmine glanced out the window. Both engines still appeared to be functioning, but the plane's erratic movements suggested serious control issues. Something far worse than turbulence was happening. Through the cabin, chaos erupted. A chorus of screams punctuated the sudden hissing of the oxygen system. Children wailed. An elderly man fumbled with his mask, struggling to breathe until Dr. Chen leaped across the aisle to assist him. "Everyone please remain calm and seated," Brenda shouted, her professional demeanor cracking as the plane lurched again. "Keep your masks on and brace positions ready." The aircraft banked hard to the left, then right, struggling to maintain stable flight. The overhead bins popped open, spilling bags and luggage into the aisle. A flight attendant was thrown against a seat, crying out in pain. Bradley clutched Jasmine's arm with crushing force. "We're going down, aren't we?" he wheezed, his face ashen beneath the plastic mask. Before she could answer, the intercom crackled to life. Captain Miller's voice came through, strained and urgent. "This is your captain. We're experiencing a serious system malfunction and medical emergency in the cockpit." The plane dipped again as if to emphasize his words. "If there's anyone with significant flight experience on board, especially," his voice cracked, a sound of desperation Jasmine had heard before in combat situations, "any commercial or fighter pilots, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The request hung in the air, competing with the cacophony of alarms and human panic. Henry Wilson stood up, swaying as the plane continued its unstable path. "I was an airline executive," he shouted. "I can." "Sit down," multiple passengers yelled back. "We need a pilot, not a desk jockey," someone added. Brenda stumbled down the aisle, gripping seat backs for stability. "Is there anyone?" Her eyes scanned the faces, searching for confidence amid the fear. "Anyone with flight experience?" In the sudden silence that followed her plea, all that could be heard was the irregular rhythm of the engines and the sound of frightened breathing through oxygen masks. Jasmine felt the weight of every eye in the cabin slowly turning toward her. Bradley, despite his terror, seemed to suddenly remember their earlier conversation. "Her," he said, pointing at Jasmine with a shaking hand. "She's a fighter pilot." Brenda's eyes widened as she looked at Jasmine, skepticism warring with desperate hope. "Ma'am? Is that true?" The moment crystallized for Jasmine. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed collided with the immediate life-or-death reality. There was no room for hesitation, no time to worry about whether people would second-guess her capability because of her gender or race. She unclicked her seatbelt and stood, bracing herself against the lurching movement of the aircraft. "Major Jasmine Washington, United States Air Force," she stated, her voice carrying the authority of countless missions and training exercises. F-35 Squadron Commander. "I need to get to the cockpit now." Another violent shudder ran through the plane. Warning lights flashed throughout the cabin. Through the windows, passengers could see they were losing altitude, clouds rushing by at alarming speed. "Thank God," Brenda breathed, then raised her voice. "Everyone please remain seated with your oxygen masks on. We have a pilot who's going to assist the captain." As Jasmine moved toward the cockpit, she heard Henry Wilson's indignant voice behind her, "That's who we're depending on. We need a real pilot, not some." "Shut up, man." Bradley snapped back, surprising even himself with his vehemence. "She flies fighter jets for the military." Dr. Chen stood up as Jasmine passed. "What can I do?" she asked calmly. "The co-pilot may need medical attention," Jasmine replied. "Can you come with me?" Together they made their way forward, bracing against seats as the plane continued its erratic movements. The flight attendants cleared a path, their faces showing equal parts doubt and hope as they looked at the black woman who claimed she could help save them. As they reached the cockpit door, another alarm blared through the cabin. The plane banked sharply again, sending Jasmine against the wall. "Security protocols," Brenda shouted over the noise, punching an emergency code into the keypad. "Captain has to approve entry even in emergency." The intercom crackled again. "This is Captain Miller. We're declaring an emergency with air traffic control. Our first officer is incapacitated." His voice sounded strained, as if he were physically struggling with the controls. "I need any available pilot assistance immediately. Our primary systems are failing, and we're losing altitude control." The cockpit door finally clicked open, revealing a scene of crisis. First Officer Taylor slumped unconscious in his chair, oxygen mask dangling unused beside him. Captain Miller, a white man in his 50s with graying temples, struggled with the controls, sweat pouring down his face as he simultaneously tried to fly the plane and radio for help. He glanced back, his expression shifting from hope to visible shock when he saw Jasmine. For a painful instant, she recognized the look, the quick double-take, the momentary hesitation that had greeted her throughout her career. "You're the pilot?" he asked, disbelief evident even amid the crisis. "Major Jasmine Washington, F-35 combat pilot," she repeated firmly, already assessing the instrument panel. "What systems are we losing?" Before the captain could respond, the plane dropped again, alarms blaring as the altitude indicator spun downward. Everyone in the cockpit was momentarily weightless as the aircraft plummeted through the sky. Behind them, in the main cabin, passengers screamed as their worst fears seemed to be coming true. As the plane stabilized temporarily, Jasmine surveyed the chaos in the cockpit. Warning lights illuminated the control panel like a macabre Christmas display. First Officer Taylor remained unconscious, his complexion gray beneath his oxygen mask. Dr. Chen immediately moved to check his vital signs. Possible stroke, she reported calmly, checking his pupils with a penlight. He needs immediate medical attention. Captain Miller fought with the controls, his knuckles white with strain. His eyes darted between Jasmine and the instrument panel, skepticism warring with desperation. Major Washington, was it? He asked, his voice tight. I appreciate your offer, but I need someone familiar with Boeing commercial systems. Another violent shudder ran through the aircraft. More warning lights flashed on. Hydraulic pressure dropping, Jasmine noted, already scanning the familiar patterns of crisis. Your stabilizer controls are compromised. I can see the electrical system is cycling irregularly too. Miller's eyebrows raised slightly. You know 737s? No, but I know aircraft emergency protocols, she replied, slipping into the first officer's seat as Dr. Chen carefully moved Taylor to the floor of the cockpit. And right now, you need another pair of hands more than you need perfect familiarity. Have you ever been in a situation where your skills were questioned just because of what you look like? Comment, number 1, if you've experienced someone doubting your abilities based on your appearance. Like and subscribe if you believe skill should matter more than assumptions. What would you have done in Jasmine's position? Would you have stepped up or stayed quiet? Let's see what happened next. The moment took Jasmine back to her first day at flight school, standing in formation as an instructor walked past, stopped, looked her up and down, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, Washington. You sure you're in the right place? It had been the first of countless times she'd had to prove herself before being allowed to demonstrate her skills. Even after becoming one of the top pilots in her class, even after combat missions in which she'd saved lives, even after promotion to squadron commander, the doubt was always the first response. But in a failing aircraft at 30,000 feet, there was no time for the usual dance of proving herself worthy of basic respect. Captain, she said firmly, I have over 3,000 flight hours and have handled multiple in-air emergencies. I've landed damaged aircraft under enemy fire. I need you to tell me exactly what's happened so far, and then we need to work together. Something in her tone, the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded in life-or-death situations, finally cut through Miller's hesitation. Electrical malfunction started about 40 minutes ago, he explained, still wrestling with the controls. Then Taylor complained of dizziness, slurred speech, collapsed about 10 minutes ago. After that, hydraulic warnings started. We're losing control surface responsiveness. Rudders sluggish, elevators barely responding. Jasmine nodded, hands already moving across the co-pilot's controls, feeling for responsiveness. We need to reduce altitude gradually, find the sweet spot where we have maximum control. I've been trying, Miller said through gritted teeth. But below 25,000, the turbulence from this storm system will be the least of our problems if we lose hydraulics completely, Jasmine finished. She glanced at the navigation system. What's our nearest diversion option? Albuquerque is about 100 miles south, Miller said. But with these control issues, we need somewhere closer. Jasmine studied the map. What about Holloman Air Force Base? I trained there. They have emergency response equipment, long runways. Miller looked surprised. That's restricted military airspace. I have clearance codes, she replied. And they'll waive protocols for an emergency landing. In the cabin behind them, Brenda appeared at the cockpit door. Captain, passengers are panicking. What should I tell them? Miller glanced at Jasmine, a silent question passing between them. Tell them we have an experienced pilot assisting and we're diverting to the nearest appropriate airfield, Jasmine suggested. Be honest about the situation being serious but emphasize that we're working to resolve it. Don't specify the details of our mechanical failures. Miller nodded his agreement, and Brenda disappeared back into the cabin. As Jasmine helped stabilize the aircraft, memories flashed through her mind, her father taking her to air shows as a child, her flight instructor telling her she'd need to be twice as good to get half the recognition, the faces of her squadron members when she first took command. All those experiences had prepared her for this moment. Air traffic control is skeptical about our diversion request, Miller reported after a radio exchange. They're suggesting we continue to Albuquerque where emergency services are already being notified. Put me through, Jasmine requested. When Miller hesitated, she added, Captain, we don't have time for protocol or pride. He handed her the radio. This is Major Jasmine Washington, U.S. Air Force, she stated clearly. I am assisting Captain Miller with a dual emergency, medical and mechanical. We need immediate clearance to Holloman AFB, priority landing. Authentication code Sierra Tango 947. There was a pause, then, stand by for verification, flight 2187. Jasmine handed the radio back to Miller and focused on the failing hydraulic systems. The control wheel was growing increasingly resistant in her hands. They don't believe I'm military, she said matter-of-factly, not looking up from the instruments. Miller frowned. How can you tell? Because I've heard that silence 1,000 times before. She adjusted the throttle slightly. But they'll check the code, and then they'll clear us. As if on cue, the radio crackled again, flight 2187, authentication confirmed. You are cleared for emergency approach to Holloman AFB. Emergency services are being notified. Please advise of your specific situation. While Miller detailed their mechanical issues, Dr. Chen looked up from attending to First Officer Taylor. His condition is stable but critical. Definite signs of a stroke. The sooner we land, the better his chances. Jasmine nodded, dividing her attention between the failing controls and the navigation display. 50 miles to Holloman. At our current speed, about 12 minutes. Let's hope the hydraulics hold that long. The plane shuddered again, dropping several hundred feet before they could arrest the descent. System pressures still dropping, Miller reported tensely. We're losing the ailerons. Jasmine thought quickly, drawing on her combat experience. We need to use differential thrust to assist with directional control. If the ailerons fail completely, we can still maintain some turning capability by adjusting power to each engine independently. Miller gave her a sidelong glance that mixed surprise with newfound respect. That's fighter pilot thinking. That's survival thinking, she corrected. I've limped back to base with half my control surfaces shot away. This isn't so different. Outside the cockpit, the situation in the passenger cabin had evolved. Brenda had informed everyone that they were being assisted by a qualified pilot, but had deliberately remained vague. Most passengers assumed that meant a male commercial pilot among them had stepped forward. Bradley Thompson, however, had become an unexpected advocate. It's the woman who was sitting next to me, he told those nearby. She's an Air Force commander. Combat pilot. Henry Wilson scoffed loudly. A woman? In a real crisis? Captain Miller would never. Shut up, man, Bradley snapped again, finding courage in crisis he hadn't known he possessed. I heard her introduce herself. She flies F-35s. That's a $50 million fighter jet. 100 million, actually, corrected an Air Force veteran seated nearby. And if she's qualified on those, she's among the best pilots in the world, regardless of gender. The debate was cut short as the plane lurched again, more violently this time. Oxygen masks swung wildly from the ceiling. A flight attendant was thrown to the floor. In the cockpit, alarms blared with renewed urgency. We've lost the main hydraulic system completely, Miller announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. Switching to backup. Jasmine was already adjusting the throttles, using engine power to help maintain attitude control. Backup system's pressure is fluctuating too, she observed. We need to start emergency landing preparations now. Holloman Tower needs to know we may have limited to no flap control for landing. Miller nodded, making the call while Jasmine continued her struggle with the increasingly unresponsive aircraft. They're clearing all traffic, he reported. Emergency vehicles standing by. But without full hydraulics. We'll manage, Jasmine stated with the calm certainty of someone who had faced worse odds and survived. "I've landed with less." As they began their approach to Holloman, she thought again of her father. He had always believed in her, even when the world seemed determined to place limitations on her dreams. "The sky doesn't care what you look like, Jazzy," he'd said. "It only respects those who respect it." Now, with hundreds of lives depending on her skills, those words had never felt more true. "Flaps at 15, Captain Miller called out, fighting the controls as the damaged aircraft descended toward Holloman Air Force Base. Attempting to extend, Jasmine responded, but the resistance in the controls told its own story. "Flap response is minimal. We're getting maybe 5 degrees actual extension." The situation had deteriorated rapidly in the minutes since they'd made the decision to divert. The main hydraulic system had failed completely, and the backup system was operating at less than 40% efficiency. The result was an aircraft that responded sluggishly to commands, requiring immense physical effort from both pilots to maintain controlled flight. Dr. Chen had secured First Officer Taylor as best she could for the approaching landing attempt. "His condition is stable but critical," she reported. "Blood pressure is elevated, likely from the stroke." "Tower's asking about our fuel situation," Miller said, sweat streaming down his face from the exertion of wrestling with the controls. Jasmine glanced at the fuel gauges. "We've burned more than expected with all these corrections. About 40 minutes of flight time remaining." "Not much margin for error," Miller noted grimly. "We won't need it," Jasmine replied with the confidence that had carried her through combat missions where failure meant death. "We're going to put this bird down safely on the first attempt." The aircraft shuddered again, dropping several hundred feet before they could arrest the descent. Warning indicators continued to flash across the instrument panel. "Electrical system degradation continuing," Jasmine noted, quickly analyzing the pattern of failures. "It's systemic. Whatever caused the initial problem is cascading through the backup systems." Miller nodded, his earlier skepticism about Jasmine completely gone. Now they were just 2 pilots fighting together to save their aircraft and passengers. "Reminds me of a situation over eastern Afghanistan," Jasmine said as she adjusted the throttles to compensate for the failing control surfaces. "Took heavy fire during close air support. Lost primary hydraulics, partial electrical failure." "How'd you manage?" Miller asked, genuinely curious despite their dire circumstances. "Improvised. Used thrust differential for basic directional control. Calculated minimum control airspeed and found the sweet spot where I had just enough authority to make it home." She glanced at him. "That's what we're doing now. Finding the sweet spot." Through the cockpit windows, the New Mexico desert was becoming increasingly visible as they descended through 20,000 feet. Holloman's runways were still invisible in the distance, but Jasmine knew the layout from her training days. "Requesting runway 25, she told Miller. "It's the longest, and the prevailing wind should give us the best approach angle with our compromised controls." Miller relayed the request to the tower, then reported, "They're clearing it now. Emergency vehicles are in position." "We need to brief the cabin," Jasmine said. "This won't be a normal landing. They need to be prepared for potential injury." Miller nodded and picked up the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller. We are 20 minutes from an emergency landing at Holloman Air Force Base. We are experiencing significant control issues, and while we expect to land safely, it will be rougher than normal. Please listen carefully to flight attendant instructions for bracing positions." As he continued providing details, Jasmine focused on maintaining their gradually descending flight path. The control will fought her with every movement, requiring constant correction. The rudder pedals were similarly resistant, making coordinated turns nearly impossible. "What's your assessment?" Miller asked after completing the announcement. Jasmine didn't sugarcoat it. "Landing gear is hydraulically actuated. With the system failures we're experiencing, we may not get normal extension. We should prepare for possible gear-up landing." That significantly increases the risk, Miller said, tension evident in his voice. It does, Jasmine agreed. But we have options. Holloman has emergency phone capabilities for exactly this scenario. And their crash teams train for military aircraft incidents, which are typically more complex than commercial emergencies. Miller considered this, then nodded. You're familiar with the base. I'll defer to your judgment on approach. Air traffic control is requesting an update on our status, Miller reported after another radio exchange. Tell them we're maintaining controlled descent but experiencing progressive system failure, Jasmine replied. Request foam on the runway as precautionary measure in case of landing gear failure. As Miller relayed this information, Jasmine ran through mental calculations. With their current glide path and speed, they would reach Holloman in approximately 15 minutes. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, but she'd flown damaged planes before. The key was to anticipate the aircraft's behavior, to work with its damaged systems rather than fighting against them. Let's try the landing gear now, she suggested. We need to know what we're dealing with while we still have some hydraulic pressure. Miller agreed, reaching for the landing gear controls. Gear down, he announced, activating the system. The familiar mechanical sound of the gear deployment mechanism was followed by silence. No confirmation lights. No positive lock indication, Miller reported tensely. Pressure's too low. Let's recycle and try again, Jasmine said calmly, though she had expected this outcome. They tried twice more, with the same result. The landing gear was partially extended but not locked in position. Perhaps the worst possible scenario. Partial extension creates more drag and increases landing risk, Jasmine noted. Decision time, Captain. Attempt to shake them loose for full extension, force them back up, or land as is. Miller weighed the options. What's your recommendation, Major? Force them back up, request maximum foam deployment, and prepare for belly landing, she replied without hesitation. It's the most controllable scenario given our hydraulic situation. In the main cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a tense, quiet dread. Brenda and the other flight attendants had instructed everyone in proper bracing positions and were securing the cabin for landing. Bradley Thompson, still in first class, had become uncharacteristically helpful, assisting elderly passengers with their oxygen masks and explaining the bracing position to a frightened child. Henry Wilson, however, continued to mutter disapprovingly. A woman fighter pilot? In this situation? Miller must be desperate. That woman fighter pilot is probably the only reason we're still flying, snapped Dr. Chen's colleague, who had been helping care for a passenger who had fainted. Fighter pilots train for emergency scenarios commercial pilots never face. Back in the cockpit, Jasmine and Miller had made their decision and informed the tower. Emergency foam trucks were deploying along the runway, preparing for a belly landing. We should warn the passengers, Miller said, reaching for the intercom. Wait, Jasmine interrupted, studying the altimeter. Let's try something first. Drawing on her fighter pilot experience, she initiated a controlled side-slit maneuver, deliberately creating a slight skid while maintaining their descent path. What are you doing? Miller asked, though he didn't interfere. Sometimes a bit of lateral stress can help free stuck mechanisms, she explained. It's a fighter pilot trick. Worth trying before we commit to a belly landing. To their amazement, after the third attempt, the landing gear indicators flickered, then showed green across all three positions. We have positive gear lock. Miller announced with the first real hope in his voice since the crisis began. Don't celebrate yet, Jasmine cautioned. We still have minimal control surface authority. This landing will be like trying to thread a needle wearing oven mitts. As they descended through 10,000 feet, they could now see Holloman Air Force Base spread out before them. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their lights flashing in the desert sun. Air Force training kicking in, Jasmine murmured, almost to herself. Never thought I'd be landing a commercial airliner here. Your training is saving a lot of lives today, Miller acknowledged. Including mine. The radio crackled with the voice of Holloman Tower, Flight 2187, we have you visual, 5 miles out. Wind 240 at 8 knots. Runway is foamed and clear. Emergency services standing by. Flight 2187, copy all, Miller responded. Be advised we are experiencing minimal control authority and expect rough landing. Jasmine focused intensely on the approach path, making tiny adjustments to the throttles to compensate for the aircraft's diminished responsiveness. Years of combat flying had honed her skills for precisely this type of situation, where split-second decisions and perfect control inputs meant the difference between life and death. 1,000 feet, Miller called out, monitoring their altitude. Runway in sight, Jasmine confirmed. Maintaining approach speed at 150 knots. Inside the passenger cabin, Brenda's voice could be heard giving final instructions, heads down. Stay down. Brace, brace, brace. As the damaged airliner descended toward the runway, Jasmine was transported back to her father's workshop, his words echoing in her mind, flying isn't about fighting the air, Jazzy. It's about working with it. Listen to what the plane is telling you. Right now, the plane was telling her it was barely hanging on, systems failing, control surfaces responding with agonizing sluggishness. But it was still flying, still responding just enough to be guided home. 500 feet, Miller called. Jasmine made a final adjustment to their approach angle. I've got this, she said with quiet confidence. In those final moments before touchdown, with hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, no one cared about her gender or the color of her skin. All that mattered was her skill, her training, and her unwavering focus as she guided the crippled airliner toward the safety of the ground. In the main cabin, with the plane's nose pitched down toward Holloman Air Force Base, a strange calm had settled over the passengers. The initial panic had given way to a resigned acceptance. Whatever happened next was beyond their control. Bradley Thompson, the businessman who had dismissed Jasmine's abilities earlier, now found himself defending her to anyone who would listen. She's an F-35 pilot, he explained to the elderly couple across the aisle, his voice hushed but intense. Combat decorated. She knows what she's doing. The realization of his own prejudice had hit him hard during the crisis. He'd spent the entire first hour of the flight making assumptions about Jasmine, never once considering she might be the most qualified person on the aircraft to handle an emergency. I don't care who's flying, muttered the husband of the elderly couple. I just want to live to see my grandkids again. His wife squeezed his hand. If she's military, she's trained for worse than this. 3 rows back, Henry Wilson continued his campaign of doubt. Fighter pilots are trained for completely different aircraft, he insisted to his increasingly unreceptive audience. Commercial jets require specific knowledge of. Will you please shut up? The sharp voice belonged to a middle-aged woman in a business suit. My brother was a commercial pilot. He always said military pilots were the best trained in the world. So unless you're qualified to land this plane yourself, stop undermining the people trying to save our lives. Wilson's face reddened, but for once, he had no retort. Near the emergency exit row, Dr. Chen's colleague, Dr. Patel, was helping a flight attendant care for a passenger experiencing a panic attack. Deep breaths, Dr. Patel instructed calmly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. The plane jolted again, eliciting gasps throughout the cabin. I heard they're having trouble with the landing gear, whispered a teenager to his mother. That's just a rumor, she replied, though her white-knuckled grip on the armrests betrayed her own fear. Brenda, who had returned from the cockpit, overheard the exchange. After a moment's hesitation, she knelt beside them. We have an experienced pilot assisting Captain Miller, she said quietly. Major Washington is one of the Air Force's top fighter pilots, and she's handled situations worse than this. The woman who was in first class, the mother asked, surprised. Brenda nodded. She's the reason we were able to divert to Holloman. She knew the base from her training days. The information spread through the cabin in hushed whispers. Jasmine's identity as the assisting pilot had been deliberately left vague in earlier announcements, but now passengers were connecting the dots. For Bradley, the revelation brought a wave of shame as he recalled his earlier condescension. When Jasmine had mentioned being a fighter pilot, he'd made assumptions about affirmative action and lowered standards, assumptions that now seemed not just offensive but absurd as her expertise was the only thing standing between them and disaster. He thought about his own daughters, aged 12 and 14, and the messages he'd been unconsciously sending them about what they could achieve. What limitations had he placed on their ambitions with his casual sexism and racial bias? The intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Miller. We are on final approach to Holloman Air Force Base. Our landing will be rougher than normal due to control issues. Please remain in brace position until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Emergency vehicles are standing by, but we expect to land safely." There was a pause, then Miller added something he rarely did in his 20 years of flying. "I want to acknowledge Major Jasmine Washington of the United States Air Force, whose exceptional skill has been invaluable during this emergency. We're in good hands." The announcement sent another ripple through the cabin. Bradley felt an unexpected surge of pride on Jasmine's behalf, pride mixed with lingering shame at his own behavior. The plane banked slightly, aligning with the runway. Through the windows, passengers could see emergency vehicles lining the tarmac, their lights flashing in the bright New Mexico sun. "Heads down. Stay down." Brenda called out. "Brace, brace, brace." As the aircraft descended the final few hundred feet, Bradley found himself thinking about his father, a man who had never questioned the capabilities of women or people of color, who had taught him better than the biases he'd developed. What would he think of his son now? "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, then tucked his head down as instructed, preparing for impact. In seat 17C, a young black girl of about 10 years old clutched her father's hand tightly. "Daddy," she whispered, "did they say a lady pilot is helping save us?" Her father nodded, squeezing her hand. "A black woman, baby. One of the best pilots in the Air Force." The girl's eyes widened. Despite the fear of their situation, a small smile formed on her lips. "Like me?" "Just like you," her father confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "Remember what I always tell you? We can be anything," she recited, just as the plane's wheels touched down on the runway. The landing was indeed rough, a hard bounce followed by firm contact with the runway. The aircraft shuddered violently as reverse thrusters engaged, the pilots fighting to keep it centered on the tarmac. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the plane might veer off the runway, but then it straightened, gradually slowing as it rolled past the halfway point. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, like a delayed thunderclap, applause erupted throughout the cabin, punctuated by cries of relief and joy. Bradley found himself cheering louder than anyone, tears streaming down his face, tears of relief, but also of something like revelation. In his mind, he was already composing the conversation he would have with his daughters when he got home, about assumptions and capability and how he'd been saved by a pilot some people wouldn't have given a chance. Even Henry Wilson sat in silent contemplation, his earlier protestations forgotten as the reality sank in. They were alive, largely due to the skills of someone he had dismissed based solely on appearance. As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and the door preparations began, Brenda's voice came over the intercom one final time, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until directed to exit. On behalf of Captain Miller and Major Washington, welcome to Holloman Air Force Base." At the name, Washington, the applause redoubled, a spontaneous tribute to the woman many of them had overlooked or underestimated just hours earlier. In the cockpit, unaware of the accolades, Jasmine Washington was still focused on securing the aircraft, shutting down systems, and ensuring the safety of everyone on board, just as she had been trained to do, regardless of who was watching or what they thought of her. "Shutdown checklist complete," Captain Miller announced, his hands finally releasing their death grip on the control yoke. Despite the air conditioning, sweat soaked through his uniform shirt. Beside him, Jasmine methodically worked through her side of the post-landing procedures, her movements precise despite the exhaustion evident in her face. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights casting red and blue patterns through the cockpit windows. "You did it, Major," Miller said, his voice carrying newfound respect. "That landing. I've never seen anything like it." "We did it," Jasmine corrected, though she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "How's First Officer Taylor?" Dr. Chen looked up from where she was monitoring the unconscious man. "Stable, but he needs immediate specialized care. The stroke symptoms are significant." No sooner had she spoken than the cockpit door opened. 2 Air Force paramedics stepped in, directed by Brenda. "We've got a medical team for the co-pilot," one announced, "and buses are coming for the passengers." Miller nodded. "Get him out first. Priority medical evacuation." As the paramedics carefully extracted First Officer Taylor from the cockpit, Jasmine completed the last of the shutdown procedures. The enormity of what they'd just accomplished began to sink in. Hundreds of lives had depended on their ability to land a critically damaged aircraft with failing systems. "Base commanders requesting to speak with both of you," Brenda informed them. "And the passengers, they know it was you, Major Washington." Word spread. Jasmine nodded, too exhausted for the moment to worry about what that meant. Throughout her career, she'd grown accustomed to being either invisible or hypervisible, rarely just another professional doing her job. "Let's get the passengers safely off first," she said. "Then we can deal with everything else." The evacuation proceeded smoothly at first. Emergency slides were deployed as a precaution, though the aircraft had landed intact. Passengers filed out in orderly groups, stepping onto the hot tarmac where Air Force personnel directed them to waiting buses. Jasmine remained in the cockpit with Miller, coordinating with ground control and completing necessary documentation. The immediate crisis was over, but the administrative aftermath was just beginning. "Air traffic control is requesting our flight data recorder be secured immediately," Miller reported after a radio exchange. "Standard procedure for an incident like this," Jasmine agreed. Suddenly, warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Systems that had been powered down were inexplicably reactivating. Electrical surge, Jasmine identified immediately, her hands moving to the master switches. "Something's shorting in the main bus." Before either pilot could fully react, a loud pop echoed through the cockpit, followed by the acrid smell of burning electronics. Smoke began seeping from beneath the instrument panel. "Fire!" Miller shouted, reaching for the extinguisher. Jasmine was already on the radio. "Ground control, Flight 2187. We have an electrical fire in the cockpit. Requesting immediate fire response." "Copy that, 2187. Fire team is moving to your position now." The smoke thickened rapidly, filling the cockpit with toxic fumes. Both pilots pulled their shirts over their noses, but the choking cloud made it difficult to see or breathe. "We need to evacuate," Jasmine urged, coughing. Miller tried to respond but doubled over in a coughing fit, clearly struggling to breathe. The extinguisher he'd deployed had little effect on the growing electrical fire. Jasmine grabbed his arm. "Captain. We need to get out now." He nodded weakly, but as they turned toward the door, Miller collapsed, overcome by smoke inhalation. With no time to waste, Jasmine grabbed him under the arms and began dragging him toward the exit. The smoke was now billowing out into the main cabin, where the last few passengers were still evacuating. "Fire in the cockpit!" Brenda shouted to her colleagues. "Get everyone out now." Through the thickening smoke, Jasmine struggled to drag Miller's unconscious form. Her lungs burned, and her eyes watered, making it nearly impossible to see. But her combat training had prepared her for exactly this kind of crisis, when adrenaline, instinct, and muscle memory took over from conscious thought. Outside, the Air Force fire response team was rushing toward the aircraft, but they were still precious seconds away. In the main cabin, the last group of passengers was hurrying toward the exits. Bradley Thompson, who had been helping an elderly woman, turned back and saw Jasmine emerging from the cockpit, dragging the captain. Without hesitation, he rushed toward her. "Let me help." Together, they carried Miller toward the nearest exit as smoke continued to pour from the cockpit. The few remaining flight attendants were coughing violently, struggling to maintain order as panic threatened to overwhelm the final evacuation. "Everyone off now," Jasmine ordered, her military command voice cutting through the chaos. "Leave everything. Move." The authority in her tone had an immediate effect. The remaining passengers rushed to the exits, sliding down the emergency chutes onto the tarmac below. At the exit row, Jasmine and Bradley maneuvered Miller's unconscious form toward the door, but the smoke was now so thick they could barely see. Jasmine's lungs screamed for clean air, and she could feel her consciousness beginning to fade. Almost there, Bradley encouraged, though his own voice was weak from coughing. Just as they reached the door, a secondary electrical explosion rocked the cockpit. The concussive force knocked them forward, and Jasmine lost her grip on Miller. As she struggled to regain her balance, she realized with horror that the captain had slid away from her in the confusion. "Captain Miller," she called out, dropping to her knees to search through the smoke-filled cabin. "I can't see him." Bradley coughed. The heat was intensifying as the fire spread from the cockpit into the cabin. They had seconds, not minutes, before the entire front section would be engulfed. There. Jasmine spotted Miller's form, now partially obscured by a fallen ceiling panel. She crawled toward him, fighting against the increasing heat and her oxygen-deprived muscles. Outside, the fire response team had reached the aircraft and was preparing to board, but Jasmine knew they wouldn't make it in time. With one final surge of effort, she reached Miller and once again began dragging him toward the exit, where Bradley waited to help. Together, they maneuvered his unconscious form to the door. "You first," Jasmine told Bradley. "Then help me lower him down." Bradley slid down the emergency chute and positioned himself at the bottom, arms raised to receive the captain. With the last of her strength, Jasmine carefully maneuvered Miller through the door and down to Bradley's waiting arms. Only then did she allow herself to follow, tumbling down the slide as consciousness began to slip away. She landed hard on the tarmac, barely aware of the hands that immediately surrounded her, Air Force personnel, paramedics, firefighters all rushing to move them away from the burning aircraft. As an oxygen mask was placed over her face, Jasmine's fading vision caught sight of the young black girl she'd glimpsed earlier, standing safely with her father at the perimeter, watching wide-eyed as Jasmine was carried to safety. In that moment, before darkness claimed her, Jasmine thought of her own father and his unwavering belief in her. "See, Dad," she whispered beneath the oxygen mask. "The sky didn't care what I looked like after all." Then consciousness slipped away entirely as the heroes who had saved Flight 2187 were themselves carried to safety, while behind them, the aircraft that had brought them through impossible odds was finally consumed by flames. Jasmine awoke to the steady beep of medical monitors and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in Germany after her last combat mission. Then reality rushed back, the flight, the emergency, the fire. She tried to sit up but was immediately overcome by a coughing fit. Her throat felt raw, her chest tight. "Easy there, Major," came a familiar voice. Dr. Chen stood beside the bed, checking Jasmine's vitals. "Smoke inhalation. You're at the Holloman Medical Center." "Captain Miller?" Jasmine asked, her voice hoarse. "Recovering. Thanks to you, he suffered only minor burns and moderate smoke inhalation." "Dar." Chen adjusted Jasmine's oxygen flow. "First Officer Taylor is in surgery. The neurologists are optimistic. The passengers? All safe. Minor injuries during evacuation, but nothing serious." Dr. Chen smiled. "You're the hero of the hour." Jasmine shook her head slightly. "Just doing my job. That's what all the real heroes say," came another voice from the doorway. Bradley Thompson stood there, looking considerably humbler than he had on the plane. A bandage covered one forearm where he'd been burned helping with Miller. "Mr. Thompson," Jasmine acknowledged. "I owe you an apology," he said, stepping into the room. "The assumptions I made, they were inexcusable." "Not the first time," Jasmine replied simply. "Probably not the last." "But it should be," Bradley insisted. "I have 2 daughters. I've never wanted to think of myself as someone who would limit their possibilities based on." He trailed off, uncomfortable with naming his own biases. "Based on what they look like," Jasmine finished for him. He nodded, chastened. "I've been on the phone with them. Telling them about you. About what you did." Before Jasmine could respond, an Air Force officer appeared at the door, Colonel James Rivera, the base commander, judging by his insignia. "Major Washington," he greeted her formally. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and everyone at Holloman, I want to extend our gratitude and admiration for your actions today." "Thank you, sir," Jasmine replied automatically, military courtesy ingrained despite her condition. "The NTSB investigation team has arrived," Rivera continued. "They'll want your statement as soon as the doctors clear you. But I wanted you to know that preliminary data from the flight recorder confirms what we all witnessed. Your actions saved that aircraft and everyone aboard. Captain Miller deserves equal credit," Jasmine insisted. "We worked as a team. Captain Miller has been quite clear about your role," Rivera said with a smile. His exact words were, "She flew that plane when it didn't want to be flown." A nurse entered to check Jasmine's vitals, and Colonel Rivera excused himself, promising to return later for a more detailed debriefing. Bradley stepped back as well, but not before placing something on Jasmine's bedside table, a small model airplane, purchased from the base exchange. "My daughters want to meet you," he said quietly. "When you're recovered. If that's okay." After they had gone, Dr. Chen helped Jasmine sit up to sip some water. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Chen said. "The media has picked up the story. They're calling you the sleeping pilot hero." Jasmine grimaced at the sensationalism. "Great. There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "Some of the early reports, they focused on Captain Miller, assumed he was the hero. A few passengers set the record straight on social media. Now it's becoming a different kind of story. About race and gender," Jasmine guessed, having been through this before. Her achievements had often been viewed through these lenses, either minimized or overemphasized depending on the observer's agenda. "Partly," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "But mostly about courage and skill. About someone who stepped up when it mattered most, regardless of how others might perceive them." Before Jasmine could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. Dr. Chen handed it to her. It was from her brother, their first communication since their tense exchange at their father's funeral. "Just saw the news," the message read. "Dad would have been so proud. I know I am. I'm sorry for everything." Tears welled in Jasmine's eyes, tears she hadn't allowed herself during the crisis or even at her father's funeral. The emotional dam broke, and she found herself sobbing quietly as Dr. Chen discreetly stepped out to give her privacy. 2 hours later, after being examined by the base physicians, Jasmine was declared stable enough to provide her statement to the NTSB investigators. With Dr. Chen's assistance, she was moved to a conference room where Captain Miller was already seated, looking pale but alert. When he saw her, Miller stood, surprising everyone by offering a military-style salute. "Major Washington," he said formally. "It's an honor to finally meet you properly." The gesture touched Jasmine deeply. It wasn't just acknowledgement of her rank, it was recognition of her as a professional equal, something she had fought for throughout her career. The NTSB team recorded their accounts of the emergency, the initial electrical failures, First Officer Taylor's stroke, the progressive system degradation, and finally the post-landing fire. The investigators were particularly interested in Jasmine's decision-making process during the approach to Holloman. You opted for a direct approach rather than the standard emergency pattern, noted the lead investigator, reviewing the flight data. Can you explain that decision? The aircraft's control response was deteriorating rapidly, Jasmine explained. Each minute increased our risk of total hydraulic failure. I made the assessment that a shorter approach path, while technically more challenging, reduced our overall risk profile. It was the right call, Miller interjected. With our control limitations, we might not have completed a standard pattern. The questioning continued for over an hour, both pilots providing detailed accounts of their actions during the emergency. Through it all, Miller consistently credited Jasmine with the critical decisions that had saved the flight. When the formal interview concluded, one of the investigators remained behind as the others packed up their equipment. Major Washington, she said quietly, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Air Force liaison to the NTSB. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. What you did today, it's going to change things. Not just for the investigation, but for a lot of young women and people of color who dream of flying. Jasmine nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Throughout her career, she had struggled with being viewed as a symbol rather than simply a pilot. But perhaps, just this once, being a symbol wasn't so bad, if it meant opening doors for others. There's something else, Hayes continued. The Air Force Chief of Staff has been briefed on the incident. He's considering recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Jasmine blinked in surprise. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest honors a military aviator could receive, rarely awarded outside of combat situations. That's unexpected, she managed. Saving a commercial airliner with multiple critical failures. Hayes smiled. I'd say it's warranted. As Jasmine was wheeled back to her room to rest before her release, she passed through the hospital lobby where a television was tuned to a news channel. The screen showed footage of the damaged airliner, smoke pouring from its forward section as the last evacuees escaped down the slides. The ticker at the bottom read, Black female fighter pilot saves passenger jet after systems failure. Jasmine looked away, uncomfortable with the attention but knowing it was inevitable. Her father had often told her that excellence was its own reward, but also that visible excellence changed perceptions. Perhaps this was what he had meant, that sometimes, doing your job exceptionally well could ripple beyond the immediate circumstance, challenging assumptions and inspiring others. In her room, another message waited on her phone, this one from her squadron commander, Washington, you never could do anything the easy way. Brass is buzzing. When you're cleared to fly back, there's a transport standing by. Proud of you, Major. She smiled at the familiar gruff affection. Then, despite her exhaustion, she began composing a message to her brother. Some bridges, she realized, were worth rebuilding, especially when you'd stared death in the face and been given a second chance. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more attention, more navigation of the complex currents of being suddenly visible in ways she hadn't sought. But tonight, in the quiet of her hospital room, Major Jasmine Washington allowed herself to simply be grateful, for her training, for her father's unwavering belief, and for the opportunity to prove, one more time, that skill and courage transcended all other considerations when lives hung in the balance. 3 days after the emergency landing at Holloman Air Force Base, Jasmine stood before a forest of microphones in the base's press conference room. Beside her was Captain Miller, his arm in a sling from injuries sustained during the cockpit fire, but otherwise recovered. Major Washington and Captain Miller will take a few questions, announced the Air Force Public Affairs officer. Please keep in mind they are still recovering and this session will be brief. Hands shot up immediately. Jasmine pointed to a woman in the front row. Major Washington, can you walk us through what was going through your mind when the captain asked for a fighter pilot? Jasmine leaned slightly toward the microphone. Honestly, I was thinking about protocols and procedures. When you train as intensively as military pilots do, your response becomes automatic. I identified myself and did my job. But surely, the reporter pressed, you must have been aware of the significance, a black woman stepping up to save the plane when everyone else hesitated? Jasmine paused, considering her words carefully. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about my race or gender. The only identity that mattered was pilot. That said, I recognize that representation matters. If my actions inspire young women or people of color to pursue aviation, that's a wonderful side effect. Another hand went up. Captain Miller, there were early reports suggesting you single-handedly saved the aircraft. Would you like to address those? Miller leaned forward. Those reports were categorically false. Without Major Washington's expertise, particularly with severe control limitations, we would not have landed safely. Period. He paused. And I want to add that it was humbling to witness her skill. In 20 years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle a critically compromised aircraft with such precision. The questions continued for another 15 minutes, technical inquiries about the aircraft failures, queries about their backgrounds, and inevitably, questions about what it meant for a black woman to emerge as the hero of Flight 2187. Throughout, Jasmine maintained her professional composure, neither leaning into nor away from the significance others placed on her identity. She had navigated this careful balance throughout her career, acknowledging reality without allowing herself to be defined solely by how others perceived her. After the press conference, Jasmine was approached by a familiar face, Bradley Thompson, now looking remarkably different from the dismissive businessman she'd met on the flight. Major Washington, he greeted her, extending his hand. I wanted to thank you again and, well, introduce you to someone. He stepped aside to reveal a teenage girl, perhaps 14, looking at Jasmine with undisguised awe. This is my daughter, Zoe, Bradley said. She's been talking non-stop about you since I told her what happened. Hello, Zoe, Jasmine smiled. Is it true you fly F-35s? The girl asked immediately. Yes, it is. And you landed a commercial plane when its systems were failing? With Captain Miller's help, yes. Zoe looked at her father, then back to Jasmine. Dad says he was really stupid on the plane. That he said things he shouldn't have. Bradley winced but didn't contradict his daughter. We all have moments when we don't show our best selves, Jasmine said diplomatically. He's taking me to the Air and Space Museum next weekend, Zoe continued, and I'm starting flight simulator classes this summer. That sounds wonderful, Jasmine replied, genuinely touched by the gesture of support from a man who had so recently dismissed her capabilities. It's a small start, Bradley acknowledged. I've got a lot of rethinking to do about, well, a lot of things. But this seemed like a good place to begin. After they left, Jasmine was escorted to a waiting Air Force transport that would take her back to her base in San Diego. Captain Miller was there to see her off. The NTSB preliminary findings came in, he told her. They're confirming our account. Cascading electrical failure that affected the hydraulic systems, exacerbated by severe weather conditions. And First Officer Taylor? Recovering well. The doctors say he should make a full recovery, thanks to Dr. Chen's quick assistance. Miller hesitated, then added, I've been doing a lot of reflecting these past few days. About assumptions. About who we see when we look at someone. It's human nature, Jasmine said quietly. We all do it. Maybe. But that doesn't make it right. He extended his hand. If you ever decide commercial aviation might interest you, I'd be honored to have you as my co-pilot anytime. Jasmine smiled as they shook hands. I appreciate that, but the Air Force is where I belong. Lucky for them, Miller replied sincerely. 1 week later, Jasmine found herself standing beside her father's grave in the Atlanta National Cemetery. She had arranged a brief leave to visit before returning to active duty. The media attention had begun to fade, though her inbox remained full of interview requests and, more meaningfully, messages from young women and girls inspired by her story. She placed a small bouquet beside the headstone and knelt to brush some fallen leaves away from the engraved name, William Washington, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Hey, Dad, she said softly. I guess you were right after all. The spring breeze rustled through the cemetery trees as she told her father about the flight, about the landing, about all the things she wished he could have seen. She told him about reconnecting with her brother, about the Distinguished Flying Cross nomination that had been officially submitted, about the young girls now writing to her about their dreams of becoming pilots. "You always said I'd change minds by being exceptional," she continued, tracing the letters of his name with her fingers. "I just wanted to be good at my job. But I guess sometimes, being good at your job is how change happens." As Jasmine stood to leave, she noticed a woman and young girl approaching from across the cemetery. It took her a moment to recognize them, the mother and daughter she had glimpsed during the evacuation, the child who had asked if the pilot was like me. The mother looked hesitant, but the girl rushed forward. "It's you. The pilot," she exclaimed. "I told Mom it was you." Jasmine smiled. "Hello again. We're so sorry to interrupt," the mother said quickly. "We were visiting my husband's father, and Amara recognized you from the news." "It's fine," Jasmine assured her. "I was just talking to my dad." She gestured toward the headstone. "Was he a pilot too?" Amara asked. "No. But he's the reason I became one." Jasmine knelt to the girl's level. "He always told me I could fly anything with wings if I worked hard enough. That's what my dad says." Amara's eyes widened. "I'm going to be a pilot too. I already have books about it." "That's wonderful," Jasmine replied, genuinely touched. Amara's mother reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope. "We wrote to thank you, but didn't know where to send it. Would you mind giving this to Amara? She's drawn pictures of planes since she was 3, but after seeing you on the news, she's been drawing herself flying them." Jasmine accepted the letter, feeling a familiar tightness in her throat. "I'd be honored." After they left, Jasmine remained by her father's grave a moment longer. "See, Dad," she said quietly. "It's already happening. Just like you said it would." 6 months later, Jasmine Washington stood on the stage of an Air Force Academy event for prospective female cadets. She had been invited as the keynote speaker, her recent decoration with the Distinguished Flying Cross making her an obvious choice. As she looked out at the sea of young faces, diverse, eager, determined, she thought about all the barriers that remained, all the assumptions still to be challenged. But she also thought about Flight 2187, about a moment when skill and courage had transcended everything else. "Many of you have asked about that day on the plane," she began. "About what it felt like to step forward when everyone was waiting for someone else to save them. The truth is, in that moment, I wasn't thinking about making history or breaking barriers. I was thinking about my training, about the job that needed to be done." She paused, looking at the faces watching her intently. "But later, I received a letter from a 10-year-old girl named Amara who was on that flight. She wrote, 'When my dad told me a black woman like me was saving our plane, I wasn't scared anymore. I knew we would be okay.'" Jasmine let the words hang in the air for a moment. That's why representation matters. That's why every door you push open matters. Because somewhere, someone is watching and thinking, if she can do it, so can I, and they're right. After the speech, as Jasmine was gathering her notes, an aide approached with a letter that had just been delivered to the Academy for her. The return address showed it was from Captain Richard Miller. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the first all-female flight crew at Miller's airline, and a brief note, "Change happens one flight at a time. Thank you for showing us how it's done." Jasmine smiled as she tucked the letter into her uniform pocket. Her father had been right all along. Excellence was its own reward, but it also created ripples that extended far beyond any single achievement. Outside the auditorium, cadets waited to speak with her. Young women with bright eyes and determined expressions, many of them minorities who saw in Jasmine a living example of what was possible despite the barriers society often placed in their way. As she greeted them, Jasmine caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the crowd, a young girl with her father. It took a moment to place them, but then she recognized Amara and her dad from the cemetery. Major Washington. Amara called out, waving excitedly. I told my dad we had to come see you speak. Jasmine made her way through the crowd, greeting Amara with a warm smile. I'm so glad you came. How are those flying books coming along? I've read them all twice, Amara replied proudly. And Dad's taking me for my first small plane ride next month. Her father nodded. After what happened on Flight 2187, how could I not encourage her? You changed our lives that day, Major. Not just by saving them, but by showing my daughter what's possible. Jasmine knelt to Amara's level. Remember what I told you by my father's grave? About what he always said to me? Amara nodded solemnly. That you could fly anything with wings if you worked hard enough. That's right. And do you know what? He was absolutely correct. Jasmine glanced up at Amara's father, then back to the girl. The sky doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you respect it. This story of Major Jasmine Washington reminds us that excellence transcends all barriers. Throughout her life, Jasmine faced countless moments where her abilities were questioned simply because of her gender and race. Yet when crisis struck, her skill, not her appearance, made the difference between life and death. The passengers on Flight 2187 learned a powerful lesson about assumptions. Bradley Thompson discovered how his own biases nearly blinded him to recognizing the most qualified person on the plane. Henry Wilson's expertise proved worthless compared to Jasmine's actual abilities. Even Captain Miller had to overcome his initial hesitation to trust her judgment. True heroism isn't about fitting someone's preconceived image of a hero, it's about stepping forward when others step back. It's about using your training and talent regardless of whether others believe you possess them. Jasmine didn't wait for validation, she simply did what needed to be done. Perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us that representation creates possibility. When young Amara saw someone who looked like her save the day, it opened a world of potential. One act of excellence ripples outward, challenging assumptions and inspiring future generations. What assumptions have you made about others based solely on appearance? Have you ever been underestimated like Jasmine, or witnessed someone else face similar prejudice? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story inspired you, please like and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage against discrimination. Hit that share button to spread this message to someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching, and remember, your abilities define you, not others' expectations of you.